Imagine a palace, not just any palace, but Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Picture it sprawling across the peninsula, overlooking the shimmering waters of the Bosphorus. Within those walls, power pulsed, empires were decided, and lives were lived, in ways almost unimaginable to us today. And nestled within this labyrinth of power was a world all its own, the Sultan's harem. Now, when you hear the word harem, what springs to mind? Is it sultry dances, whispered secrets, a den of opulent pleasure? Hollywood has certainly done its best to paint that picture. But the reality of the Ottoman harem was far more complex, and frankly, a lot less glamorous than the movies would have you believe. The word harem itself comes from the Arabic word haram, meaning forbidden or sacred. Essentially, it was the private family quarters within the Ottoman palace. Think of it as the royal family's apartment complex, but with some very specific and, shall we say, exclusive residence at its heart. The harem was home to the Sultan's mother, the valid Sultan, a woman of immense power and influence. She was the undisputed queen of this inner world, wielding considerable sway over her son and therefore the entire empire. Imagine the most formidable mother-in-law you can conjure. Then amplify that by 1,000, add political savvy, and you're getting close to the valid Sultan. Then there were the Sultan's wives, legal consorts who bore the title Kadın. They enjoyed a certain status and privileges, but their primary role was to produce heirs to the throne. And finally, the largest group within the harem, the concubines, or Kuri. These were often young women of extraordinary beauty, many captured or purchased from across the vast Ottoman Empire. Think of them as a living, breathing tapestry woven from different cultures and ethnicities, all brought together within the palace walls. They came from all corners of the known world: Circassia, Russia, Italy, Greece. Each offered into the service of the most powerful man in the world. Life within the harem was highly structured and hierarchical. It was a world of elaborate rituals, intricate social dynamics, and constant competition. New Kuri would begin as novices, learning Turkish, Islamic customs, embroidery, music, dancing, and of course, the art of seduction. Think of it as the most intense finishing school imaginable, with the ultimate prize being the Sultan's favor. As they progressed, they would rise through the ranks, potentially becoming Gizdi, a favorite of the Sultan. And if they were lucky enough to bear him a child, especially a son, their status would skyrocket. They would become an Ikbar, or fortunate one, and a likely Kadın. These women were not powerless pawns. They were often intelligent, ambitious, and fiercely determined to secure their position and that of their children. The harem wasn't just about romance and intrigue. It was also a center of education and culture. The women were taught to read, write, play musical instruments, and engage in intellectual pursuits. Some even became renowned poets, artists, and calligraphers. Guarding this inner sanctum were the eunuchs, castrated men who held positions of considerable authority within the harem. The Kisla Aga, the chief black eunuch, was second in command, only to the valid Sultan, and controlled all access to the harem. Think of them as the palace's chief security officers, confidants, and gatekeepers. Their loyalty was unquestioned, their power absolute within those walls. Life for women in the harem was certainly a gilded cage. On one hand, they enjoyed incredible luxury, fine clothes, exquisite jewels, and access to the best education available. On the other hand, they were confined to the palace, their lives dictated by strict rules and constant surveillance. Their world was one of intense competition, where a single misstep could lead to disgrace or even death. For many, the harem represented a chance at a better life than they could have ever imagined. For others, it was a prison, a place of forced servitude and unfulfilled dreams. It was a place of beauty and brutality, of power and vulnerability, of love and betrayal. It was, in short, a microcosm of the Ottoman Empire itself, complex, contradictory, and utterly fascinating. So, that's the basic framework of the harem. But here's where things get interesting. We've talked about the structure, the hierarchy, the general rules of the game. But what about the more private, the more unconventional aspects of life within those walls? Because let's be honest, when you concentrate that much power, that much beauty, that much repressed desire, things are bound to get a little weird. And in the Ottoman court, they certainly did. Over the next portion of this video, we're going to be exploring some of the more unusual sexual practices that are rumored to have taken place within the Sultan's harem. We're going to delve into the whispers, the rumors, and the historical accounts, however dubious some may be, that hint at a world far removed from the sanitized version we often see in history books. We're talking about stories that have been passed down through generations, tales of sultans with, shall we say, particular tastes, stories of hidden desires, forbidden relationships, and practices that would certainly raise eyebrows even by today's standards. Were these practices widespread or isolated incidents? Were they the product of boredom, power, or simply individual preference? And how much of what we hear is fact, and how much is simply salacious gossip? We will examine how and where sexual power dynamics manifested themselves within the palace's occupants, and explore the documented cases of deviancy and preference. In the Sultan's bedrooms, we're going to attempt to unravel the truth behind the legends and explore the darker, more intriguing corners of Ottoman history. It's a journey into the heart of the harem, a place where pleasure and power intertwined in ways that continue to fascinate and disturb us to this day. All right, buckle up, because this is where things get interesting. We've explored the harem, the power dynamics, and the sheer scale of the sultan's options, but behind the facade of imperial obligation, behind the rows and rows of concubines and wives, lurked a world of personal desire, often veering far from the prescribed path, of producing heirs and maintaining dynastic stability. And folks, some of these paths were wild. Let's start with a sultan who often gets a bit of a pass in the history books, Suleiman the Magnificent. Now, everyone knows about his intense and very public love affair with Harem Sultan, a woman who went from being a slave girl to his legal wife, an unheard of elevation. But whisper it quietly, there are persistent rumors, never quite confirmed, but never entirely squashed either, about Suleiman's intense relationship with his Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha. These guys were inseparable. Ibrahim rose from a humble background to essentially run the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman's guidance. Their letters, which survive to this day, are filled with a level of affection that went beyond mere political alliance. My soul, my other self, they called each other. Now, was it a deep, platonic friendship, a mentorship taken to extremes? Absolutely possible. But did it fuel whispers in the corridors of Topkapi Palace about something more? You bet it did. And remember, this was a society where male friendships were often very physically affectionate. Hand-holding, cheek-kissing were common. But the level of devotion Suleiman displayed towards Ibrahim, and vice versa, definitely raised some eyebrows. It's one of those historical grey areas, folks, where the truth is probably lost to time. But the rumors themselves tell us something about the expectations and anxieties surrounding sexuality within the Ottoman court. Now, let's jump forward a bit to the 18th century, and Sultan Mahmud I, now Mahmud, was eccentric. He was known for his love of music, his patronage of the arts, and, shall we say, a particular fascination with young male servants. While outright accusations of sodomy are difficult to substantiate with concrete evidence, contemporary accounts paint a picture of a sultan who surrounded himself with attractive young men, showering them with gifts and attention. One particular page, described as being exceptionally beautiful, became a favorite of the sultan and wielded considerable influence. Historians debate whether this relationship was purely aesthetic, a kind of platonic appreciation of beauty common in the era, or something more intimate. But what's important is that the perception of impropriety existed, and it contributed to a growing sense of unease among some segments of Ottoman society. Think about it. The Sultan was supposed to be the epitome of pious Islamic leadership, the shadow of God on earth. Any hint of behavior perceived as un-Islamic, like same-sex attraction, could damage his legitimacy and fuel discontent. And speaking of scandalous perceptions, let's talk about Sultan Abdulaziz. This guy had a serious image problem. He was known for his lavish spending. His European travels a huge deal back then, and rumors swirled around his companions. One specific rumor, repeated in several contemporary sources, involved a young acrobat in the imperial circus. Apparently, the Sultan was utterly smitten, lavishing him with gifts and attention, even going so far as to have a special apartment built for him within the palace grounds. Now, again, no explicit proof of sexual acts, but the optics were terrible. It fueled a narrative of a sultan detached from his people, more interested in frivolous pleasures than the weighty matters of state. It's worth noting that Abdulaziz was later deposed and found dead in suspicious circumstances, with many believing he was assassinated. While his alleged sexual preferences were probably not the direct cause of his downfall, they certainly contributed to the atmosphere of distrust and resentment that surrounded him. Now, before everyone gets too excited about the idea of Ottoman sultans being secret rebels, let's add a crucial bit of context. Same-sex acts were, officially, a no-no in Islamic law. But, like in many societies, the application of those laws was often complicated. There was a degree of tolerance, or, perhaps more accurately, a degree of willful blindness, particularly within the elite circles of the court. As long as things were kept discreet, as long as the Sultan continued to fulfill his primary duties, namely, producing heirs and upholding the image of a strong, pious leader, a certain amount of personal indulgence could be overlooked. It was a delicate balancing act, a constant negotiation between religious doctrine, social expectations, and individual desires. But what about unusual fetishes? Now we're getting into truly murky territory. Reliable documentation is practically non-existent. These things, if they existed, would have been very carefully concealed. What we do have are snippets of gossip, often filtered through the lens of hostile European observers, eager to paint the Ottoman court as decadent and depraved. There are vague references to sultans with a fondness for certain types of clothing, or a fascination with particular body types. One persistent rumor, which I stress is incredibly difficult to verify, alleges that one sultan had a collection of elaborate shoes belonging to women from different parts of the empire. Again, is it true? Who knows? But the very fact that such rumors circulated reflects the pervasive anxieties surrounding the Sultan's power. his access to unlimited resources, and the potential for that power to be used in unconventional ways. The bottom line here, folks, is that the sexual lives of the Ottoman sultans were far more complex and nuanced than the simplistic narrative of a ruler surrounded by compliant concubines. There were power dynamics, personal desires, religious restrictions, and social expectations all swirling together, creating a potent and often contradictory mix. And while we may never know the full truth about what went on behind the closed doors of Topkapi Palace, the whispers, the rumors, and the surviving accounts offer a fascinating glimpse into a hidden world of unconventional desires and practices. But before you start judging too harshly, remember, we are looking back through the lens of centuries, applying our own modern sensibilities to a very different time and place. What might seem shocking or perverse to us today may have been perfectly acceptable, or at least tolerated, in the context of the Ottoman court, and vice versa. It's a reminder that sexuality is always shaped by culture, by power, and by the ever-elusive search for personal fulfillment. So, we've delved into some interesting aspects of the Ottoman Sultans' private lives. But what did it all mean? How were these whispers, these realities, used and abused in the ruthless game of Ottoman politics? And how do we, as modern observers, even begin to unpack this historical Pandora's box? Let's be clear, the Ottoman Empire was a society obsessed with power, legitimacy, and appearances. The Sultan, as the absolute ruler, was the embodiment of all three. His image, meticulously crafted and fiercely protected, was crucial to maintaining control, and, as we all know, sex and power have always been inextricably linked. Rumors, regardless of their veracity, could be devastating. A sultan perceived as weak, effeminate, or indulging in unnatural desires could face serious challenges to his authority. Think about it. If the sultan can't control himself, how can he control an empire? This vulnerability could be exploited by rivals, both internal and external. Imagine disgruntled janissaries being fed stories of a sultan more interested in the affections of a young male page than in leading the army. It's a powder keg waiting to ignite. On the other hand, a reputation for virility, for fathering numerous sons, was a sign of strength, a guarantee of dynastic continuity. A sultan who demonstrably populated the harem was seen as blessed by God, ensuring the survival of the Ottoman line. This wasn't just about personal gratification. It was about political stability. Consider Suleiman the Magnificent, whose long reign and numerous heirs secured the empire's golden age. His sexual prowess, whether real or imagined, contributed to his image as a powerful and divinely favored ruler. Of course, these perceptions were often carefully manipulated. Court historians, eager to please their patrons, could either emphasize or downplay certain aspects of a sultan's personal life to enhance or diminish his reputation. Think of it as the Ottoman version of spin doctors. Did a sultan have a known penchant for same-sex relations? Perhaps the court historian would focus instead on his military victories, his piety, or his generous patronage of the arts. Conversely, a sultan perceived as a threat could be painted as a decadent, sexually deviant tyrant, unfit to rule. The pen, or in this case, the scribe's quill, was mightier than the sword. But we can't analyze these claims in a vacuum. We need to understand the cultural context. The Ottoman world had different views on sexuality than our own. While Islamic law certainly condemned certain practices, such as zina, unlawful sexual intercourse, the boundaries of what was considered acceptable were often blurred. especially within the elite circles of the court. Same-sex relationships, for example, existed, and while not explicitly condoned, they were often tolerated, particularly between men. The institution of the gilman, young male pages trained for service in the palace, blurred the lines between servitude, companionship, and sexual intimacy. These relationships were often framed as expressions of male camaraderie and mentorship, rather than purely sexual acts. This isn't to say that they were universally accepted, but they were certainly more nuanced than a simple condemnation might suggest. And what about the harem itself? It was a complex institution, often misunderstood and sensationalized in Western accounts. While it undoubtedly served as a space for the Sultan's sexual pleasure and the production of heirs, it was also a center of female power, influence, and education. The women of the harem, especially the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and the Haseki Sultan, the Sultan's favorite consort, wielded considerable political clout. Accusations of sexual impropriety within the harem could be used to undermine these powerful women, discrediting their influence and destabilizing the court. So, how do modern historians approach these sensitive topics? With extreme caution, I hope we have to be aware of our own biases and the limitations of the sources. Many accounts of the Sultan's sexual lives come from biased Western travelers, eager to sensationalize the exotic East. Others are derived from court chronicles, which are inherently propagandistic. And let's face it, documenting someone's private life from centuries ago is challenging at best. Therefore, modern historians emphasize a critical approach. We analyze the sources carefully, considering the author's perspective, their potential, motivations, and the historical context in which they were writing. We look for corroborating evidence from multiple sources and avoid making sweeping generalizations based on limited or unreliable information. We also acknowledge the inherent difficulties in interpreting historical accounts of sexuality, which are often shaped by cultural norms, moral judgments, and political agendas. It's also important to remember that historical figures were complex individuals, not one-dimensional caricatures. The sultans were rulers, warriors, patrons of the arts, and, yes, human beings with their own desires, fears, and flaws. Reducing them to simple stereotypes of sexual depravity or heroic virtue is a disservice to history. In the end, separating fact from fiction when exploring the private lives of the Ottoman sultans is an almost impossible task. The rumors, the realities, the propaganda, and the cultural context are all intertwined, creating a tangled web of interpretation. But by approaching the topic with critical thinking, historical sensitivity, and a healthy dose of skepticism, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of these fascinating and controversial figures, and the complex world they inhabited, and maybe, just maybe, get a glimpse into what it means to wield absolute power and the price that comes with it. Now, let's move on to